connections, African internet interconnection economics, which is very important because especially now in Ethiopia, we are going to have many operators, and it's important that we understand how all this works. Tomorrow, yes, something that I didn't tell you, that Dr. Ahmadin unfortunately won't be able to make it, but Dr. Abiot, in fact, gave most of the keynote speech that he was going to give tomorrow. So we are not going to have Dr. Ahmadin at the keynote speech, but I hope that Dawit Burhan, I haven't seen him, is here around. Tomorrow he's going to talk about, we have to check that, because this coronavirus thing is making things complicated. He's going to talk about Ethiopia, because he is the CEO of WebSprix, which is one of the few virtual IXPs in Ethiopia, and I think he can give us a very good, overview of what are the challenges and opportunities in Ethiopia. After that, there is a very important session for me, which is bringing Ethiopia to the future. It's good to talk about the past, but the most important is the future. And Lishan is going to talk about, the successes and failures under the monopoly and what we can learn for the future. And Professor Ndemo will come back again to talk about what Ethiopia can learn for its future from Kenya. So some of the things that he said earlier, but I'm sure he has many more things to say. But after that, we will have discussions, and that is very important, because this meeting is not about people speaking and then we leave. Everybody is expected to do some work. We are going to have roundtable discussions on specific topics. So things that we need to work on if we want to have the internet that we want. So it can be on data centers, it can be on IXPs, etc. So we are going to sit around roundtables and then discuss between ourselves and come up with some concrete recommendations. Okay. Yeah. Oh, something that I forgot. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But before that, there will be panel discussions that in 3 tracks: the governance, the development, and the technical tracks. So they will help us. They will start the discussion for us, but the main discussion will be in roundtables that will be on these same tracks. Okay, so after the roundtables, so tomorrow afternoon, we are going to come up with some recommendations and hopefully also some ideas of who can implement those recommendations. And then the next day, on Wednesday, we are going to report back what are the things what are our homeworks for the years to come as Ethiopians. And I hope there will be, I hope Dr. Ahmadin will be back by then and he can come for the closing. If not, I think Mokhtar and myself, we are going to close the meeting. So we have a very loaded 2.5 days. And for those who have the afternoon free for Thursday, we can plan something to relax a little bit. So please talk to us if you don't have any idea of what you're doing in the afternoon, especially for those coming from outside Addis Ababa. Okay, so that's all for the program. Now I'm going to call upon the next moderator, who is a very famous person. Many of you already know probably on the little screen, which is our TV. He is Solomon Kassa. He is mainly known for being for having his show on EBS, which is called TechTalk. And he has kindly accepted to come here and moderate this session for us. Solomon is a tech strategist, TV personality, and author. He's currently a technology consulting and strategy manager at a Fortune 500 global consulting firm in the USA, and a host of Tech Show with Solomon, a very popular science and technology television show on EBS. He is also an author of a book that I bought, but I have yet to read, Girmita Tech. For those who speak Amharic, he's using really a very complicated Amharic, so the title frightened me, but I hope that in time it's easier to read. The first of its kind Amharic science and tech book, which was reviewed and endorsed by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Solomon, who is also a public speaker, a social media influencer with more than 425,000 followers, and a coach, gave public speaking on several platforms, including in Washington, D.C., at the U.S. Department of State's Startup at Engine of Growth, Ethiopia Partnership Forum, in Prague, the Czech Republic, at Creative, Innovative, and Participative Africa Conference, and a 5-day technology strategy and policy solo lecture to more than 1,000 Ethiopian government policymakers, executives, and officials at the headquarters of United Nations Economic Commission of Africa in Addis Ababa. Please welcome Solomon to the stage.
እንዴት ናችሁ? እንቅልፉ አለ ወይ? እዛ ጋ ያለው ቡና ጠጥታችኋል? የትራዲሽናል coffee, especially for those who came from abroad, you have to try the coffee by the lobby. It's really good. I think I want to invite the panelists here, and then I'm going to do a few words, and we're going to continue. So, please. የጠዋቱ ፕሮግራም እንዴት ነበረ? ወዳችሁታል? ያ ኢንተራክቲቭ ነው። ዝም ብለህ እዛ ቴሌቪዥን ላይ ብቻዬን ማውራት ይበቃል። ስለዚህ አሁን እናንተ ካላችሁ የቱ ሳይድ ኮሚኒኬሽን እንዲሆን ይሄም ሴሽን ካለቀ በኋላ ብዙ ጥያቄ እንድትጠይቁ እነሱም ንግግራቸውን አጭር እንዲያደርጉ ጠይቃቸዋለሁ። እናንተም ተሳታፊ እንድትሆኑ ስለምፈልግ። So an exciting past and a thrilling future of internet የሚለው ቶፒክ በጣም ጥሩ ነበር። እንዲሁም ጥሩ ጥያቄዎችን ተጠይቀው ነበረ, the internet of things and different other things. And I think when we think about IoT, for example, just from the morning question, we think about fancy things. I say this on my TV show several times because we think about smart cities and sensors on everything, but we don't really have to think about those kind of advanced innovations. The reason why we say leapfrogging is that how can we leverage those cutting-edge technologies and then use them to solve our fundamental problems in agriculture and financial inclusion. It can be transportation, it can be last-mile services. For example, in terms of IoT, I found some interesting use cases. For example, in Rwanda and Kenya, people using, I think maybe Kenya, but I know for sure Rwanda, putting a sensor in a water well to make sure that the pump works. If it doesn't, people come in and maintain it. Farmers using IoT for beehives and precision farming and for water soil quality information, and pass the information to the farmer via text, and the farmer can water soil and whatnot. So when you think about this advanced technology, think about your own problems immediately and how can I make it a use of that. And also when we talk about AI, people think of a talking robot or manufacturing robots, but AI can be a lot useful if we can bring it down to our issues and problems. So this session is going to be actually the fundamental for that whole conversation, because the session is called the foundation of internet for development. So the internet has become very large and far-reaching at this point, as you know, in 50 years of its history. The role of internet in our daily lives is so intertwined that the internet sometimes seems to be flying away of its own momentum. It became just its own ginormous thing in this world, so influential by itself as a person. However, in reality, its unprecedented success continues to thrive mainly due to vibrant internet ecosystem, which we're going to talk about, that is guiding the operation and development of technologies and infrastructure that comprise the global internet that we call the big internet, resulting in a unique technological, governance, and economic foundations. So I hope we're going to touch upon on those very, very important nuances of the internet. Players within the ecosystem collaborate, compete, debate. That's what we need here, and this is one of the manifestation for that. To create impressive technologies, open standards, and conducive policies, which is one thing that lacks in countries like Ethiopia, to maintain the growth and evolve the internet. So what does the internet ecosystem actually look like at a fundamental level? That's what these panelists will be trying to highlight for the audience. So this session will also touch the areas that I mentioned and more to explain the roles of different players and stakeholders in this ecosystem. So 3 sessions, and each of them will pick one title, one topic, and talk about it. I know you guys are given 20 minutes, but I would like it to be shorter so that the audience can get opportunity to talk about it, because this is the fundamental of internet, and I'm sure a lot of people would have so many questions, fundamental questions. So the first topic is internet technology and infrastructure fundamentals, which mainly focuses on different pieces of the internet infrastructure that makes up the interconnected network that is the internet. So to talk about that, I'm gonna invite my colleague, Olaf Kolkman. Olaf is the principal of Internet Technology Policy and Advocacy at the Internet Society, the organizer of this great event. He's a senior advisor to and spokesperson to the Internet Society as well. He formulates, reviews, and advises on technical and policy positions. Olaf has a long experience in internet technology and policy matters, which we need, and in particular, those related to security and trustworthiness of the internet. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Let me get the roaming mic here. Number one. It's green. Yeah. So I will be talking about, that woke you up after the lunch break. I will be talking about the internet model for a bit. And I've doodled some slides together, which are here. And it's pictures all the way. This picture talks about digitization. We live in a digital society. And the digital society is made possible by 2 things. The ability to digitize information, something that we have been doing since, say, the 60s on scale, and something that we have been getting into our houses with the invention of the PC. But digitizing is really about having information in our environment, analog information, turning it into a digital signal that we can store, that we can compute, that we can share. And then turn it back to analog signals so that we can work with it again. IBM started this with digitizing the office environment. And now we digitize everything. We digitize where honeybees are. We digitize the soil, digitize and measure our cities. We digitize the movements and thoughts of our people. The internet, the network of networks, allows to share the digital information globally. That has changed the world profoundly. The ability to share what we digitize, what we see in our environment on the internet is critical. And the way that it works is you take a stream of digitized information and you chop it up in little packets of information and you transfer that over the internet. That's the thing. So what is this internet? The internet is a network of networks. It's complex. It is hooked together in a somewhat non-structured way. This is just an image. There are 60,000, more than 60,000 networks currently on the internet. Over 60,000 networks. The beauty of these networks is that they are all independent. They make their own choices. A network can be an access network. An access network that lives, for instance, in a coffee shop, and that provides, or here in the conference network in the room, it provides a Wi-Fi signal, which is then sent to a switch over a copper wire and then connected to fiber to an upstream. That could be one network. And by the way, if I'm now a persona non grata for misspelling coffee on my slide with one E, I take that. This is a mortal sin in Ethiopia. Misspelling coffee with one E is of course very bad. But the thing is, independent choices. And different networks can make different choices. And sometimes focus on very specific things. We have networks that focus on providing access with, say, 5G technologies. Let's see if the laser pointer works. But like 5G networks, providing network to civilians. But we also have networks that provide satellite connectivity or build undersea fiber cables, or have a hybrid of technologies by which they share information. The point is that within those networks, all these actors make their independent choices, their own choices about what technology to invest in, what cables to dig, where to go with their connectivity. And the internet doesn't care about that. What the internet cares about is that when customers in those networks use their devices, they provide the packetized streams of information, the little packets, which we call internet protocol packets, IP packets, to the network. And what we care about is that the networks between each other exchange IP packets. What they do internally, we don't care. If they use a protocol soup of 3G, 5G, MPLS, whatever, doesn't matter. What we care about is that my device can send IP to the network, and then the network will transport it to another network, which will hand that packet over to another network, hand it over to another network, and in that way, we share the information. That gives us global connectedness. That gives us the ability to send a packet from Ethiopia back to the Netherlands, where I come from. That gives us the ability to talk globally. The only expectation is that you put an IP packet on the end and move it on the other end, get it out on the other end. That's the only thing that the networks does. And there's a lot of intelligence at the edges of the network, because if a packet gets lost, my phone will notice that the packet is lost and will resend that piece of information. The networks themselves don't really care. The beauty of that is that the networks can therefore be built with fairly cheap components. It used to be the case that if you had a telephone network, that the components had to have 5 nines of certainty, downtime of 5 minutes per year or something. That is not necessarily the case with the internet. The internet relies on resiliency and relies on being able to retransmit lost packets. That information sits at the edge of the networks. That is what Andrew referred to this morning as the end-to-end principle. That was a conscious design choice. Keep the individual networks dumb, so to speak, and just accept IP, and if a packet gets lost, that's not a big deal. Resiliency is built in the architecture at the edges. And the beauty about that is that if the expectation is that you send IP packets on the networks, the applications can do whatever they want. They don't have to ask permissions on the network. They can just deliver packets to the network and they get a transport. The applications that you build on top of the internet do not have to coordinate very strongly with that internet in order to make things work. We call that loose coupling. That means there's this protocol soup in the middle, the protocols that make up the internet. I say IP, the IP protocol, but there's a bunch of them for which you need a few, end-to-end agreements and coordination about what you use, but it's a handful of protocols. And once you have those protocols, the applications on top can just come. And if the network has sufficient capacity to support those ideas, they will become popular. When I was young, Andrew was talking about 60K connectivity. You had a phone line, a modem that went all the time. Now you're awake again, and those didn't support video. I had to download my Linux distribution, Slackware. I remember 1.4, 14 disks, 14 floppy disks. This was the time of floppy disks, and it took me a day. No way you could do video in that time. However, the people who were designing these networks knew about Moore's law, the fact that every 2 or 3 years, the capacity of storage, capacity of computing doubles. And they said, in 2-3 years, we probably can do video. And they were right. And they started building video applications. And when the networks were ready for video applications, you had YouTube. And that's the beauty about the internet. You don't have to ask permission, but things keep developing. And if you have a new idea, you attach your new idea to the internet. The people who came up with blockchain and developed the Bitcoin protocol, they didn't ask permission to anybody. They knew that if they connected to the internet and started sending IP packets, the protocol would just work. Hence we have blockchain. I think that's a great example. And you can think, whether Bitcoin is a good idea or not for global energy purposes, and whether it's good for value and so on and so forth, that's a separate discussion. It is an innovation that happened, and no permission was needed to do that to do that innovation. Another thing about this network that I think is special is that it is accessible. By which I mean that if you are a new network, you can connect to the network, to the internet, by connecting to yet only one other network. And as soon as you've done that, you're part of the internet. As soon as you take part in the network, you're part of the network. It is not the case that you have to contract with all the parties. If I send my traffic from here to the Netherlands, the ISP over here doesn't have a contract with my ISP back home. They don't have a contract with Freedom.nl, my home ISP. In fact, the network here has one contract, or maybe a handful, with their immediate partners to which they connect. And those partners have the incentive to send on traffic onward to the destination. And that's how the internet works. You don't need contracts with a whole lot of them in order for the internet to work. So business-like, this means that if you start an ISP, a small ISP, and you connect to the network, you're suddenly part of it. This is why I think that, for instance, community networks are so important, because you can get a kernel of customers and then connect to the internet. Create your own network, your own popular little internet provider, and then be part of this bigger thing. That's profound. So I was talking a little bit about business relationship. This is a little bit of a simplified picture. Usually you have nodes at the bottom of this part, which are access providers or small networks. And in order to get to the rest of the internet, they have to send their traffic upwards. And they connect to bigger networks. For instance, they would connect to the incumbent network. And that incumbent network would send the traffic to yet another network. We talk about tiers in this context. And usually the money flows up. Usually you pay, I think that's the currency in Ethiopian script, you pay money to have your traffic transported to the rest. And usually that is dependent on the amount of traffic you send. Now the beauty of the internet, 3 minutes? Oh, no way. Oh yeah. The beauty of the internet is that you can interconnect. So if you have two small networks and they interconnect, they can start to peer. And I send you my traffic if you send yours, so I don't have to pay for that traffic going upstream, but we just exchange it here. And that brings down the price of connectivity for all the customers in that circle. If you take that to the extreme, you create one place where they can all come together, an internet exchange point, then the amount of traffic that you keep locally, and that doesn't have to go up and down again, the traffic for which you have to pay, then the price of internet connectivity goes down significantly. This is not nice for the incumbents or for the transit providers, but it is very good for your local economy because it keeps your traffic local. So internet exchange points are very important. In order to make this all work, you only need a handful of things. You need global coordination with respect to the addresses that you use. You heard Afrinic being represented here. They hand out the addresses. Now the IPv4 addresses are almost out. IPv6 plentiful. And I'm not going to explain you what those are, but there is global coordination needed. You cannot just use any address. Another piece where you need global coordination, I think I missed the slide now. No, is in the routing space. In the routing space, the global coordination comes with security. It is sharing contact information, making sure that you are known to your neighbors. You coordinate what you send and what you want to receive. That's very important for routing security. We have a program called Manners, manners.org, which talks about these coordination efforts. But that's what the routing is about. And the third thing that is important is global coordination with respect to the DNS. That's an overlay that is over the network in order for people to find each other on the internet, because usually you don't remember all the IP addresses, but you do remember DNS names. A fourth thing, which I don't have on the slides, is of course the technical standards by which you glue all these things together. That's another part of global coordination. That work is done in the IT. I'm going to stop here, but I'm showing this picture with some conscious. Because what we're building here, again, coming back to what Andrew said this morning, is human technology. Once we build networks, once we create a network and made use of that property that we call accessible, you have a profound impact on humans. This is Yakzul Tinibekova. Yakzul lives in a small village in Tiamsuan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan. She got connected to the internet through a community network. She is an ICT teacher of 36 years old when this picture was taken. And being connected to the internet changed her life and changed the life of her students. And that, I think, summarizes why I work for the Internet Society. Because this is the positive impact that we can reach. We can connect people with the internet and make sure that they allow other people to grow and prosper. And with that, I think I was 1 minute over time.
Thank you so much, Olaf, for the perspective. College networking ኮሌጅ ውስጥ የኔትወርክ ክላስ ኦላፍ ከተናገራቸው ብዙዎቹ እንደ ክለሳ አላስታወሳችሁም የተማራችሁ ሰው ቴንክ ዩ ፎር ዳት ኤንድ ቴክኒካል ላልሆናችሁ ደግሞ ከቢዝነስ ሳይዱ ለመጣችሁ የኢንተርኔት ፈንዳሜንታል ይሄ ከላይ ጀስት ጫፍጫፉን ነው ዲቴይል አይደለም ያው ርዕሱም እንደምታዩት ግን መሰረታዊ የሆኑ ነገሮችን እንዳያችሁበት ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ The second pillar of this session is around internet ecosystem and governance, which is a really important topic because I think most of the time when we think about internet, we talk about or think about fast speed, you know, loading Facebook in a split second, right? and Snapchatting and all that. But really, internet is not that. It's not even the wire, it's not even the data center. It has an ecosystem. I don't know, በአማርኛም እንደሆነ ምህዳር የሚያካትተው ነገር ኢንተርኔቱን ሙሉ ኢንተርኔት ነው የሚያስብለው ነገር ዋይሩና ስፒዱ ብቻ አይደለም so that's why she's going to talk about policy governance and human capital የሰው አቅም ማስተማር ማሳደግ content መፍጠር ብዙ ናቸው so the focus is basically on relationship and collaborations among different components that exist in the global internet and necessary standards and practices to coordinate this effort so let me introduce the next speaker She's going to be talking about this topic. Anriette, Esterhuysen. I hope I said it right. So Anriette currently serves as a commissioner on the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, another very important thing that we need here in Africa as a whole. She was the executive director of the Association of Progressive Communications, also known as APC, the largest ICT-focused civil society network in the world. She served in that responsibility from 2000 to 2016. She continues to work with APC as a consultant and convenes the African School on Internet Governance, also called AfriCIG, a joint initiative of APC, the African Union, and Research ICT Africa. The floor is yours.
Okay, it's on now. Thanks very much. So I'll try and be quick. Just a bit about APC. We have a deep history in Africa and including in Ethiopia. How many of you remember something called PADISnet? I think, Lishan, you are going to have to put your hand. I see a hand at the back. This shows you how memory works. Ethiopia had in the 1990s the largest email network in Africa with more than 2,000 subscribers. This was before the commercial internet was available in Africa. It was before there were mobile phones. This network was actually run by Lishan, and APC provided the international connections to the rest of the emerging internet. So it's an interesting example because it also shows you how there was regression actually. We had in Africa very thriving email-only networks using tools like wide area internet servers, Gopher internet searching tools. And we used store and forward systems, which worked on bad phone lines. But then when the commercial internet, which relied on a permanent connection to the internet, took over, we lost connectivity. It was only really when the mobile revolution happened that we were able to start the process again. So sometimes this is true for development, it's true for policy. You can go one step forwards and two steps backwards. Okay, just to tell you a little bit about the Internet Governance Forum. I'm currently the chair of the Multistakeholder Advisory Group of the Global Internet Governance Forum. And this is an interesting thing for you to think about in Ethiopia, the concept of an Internet Governance Forum. The Global IGF emerged from a UN process, the World Summit on the Information Society. The idea is that it's a platform for people to come together from different stakeholder groups with different worldviews, technical people, media people, policy people, to talk about internet issues and problems. It's not a decision-making platform, but it's a learning and information sharing platform. And currently in Africa, there are 37 national and regional and youth IGF initiatives. There are sub-regional IGFs, there's a West African one, there's an East African one, and there are many national internet governance forums. And people criticize them for being just talk shops. But as Andrew said this morning, it's people that make change. And people acting together make more change than people acting alone. And sometimes you need to talk first before you can act together. So there is value in that. And they're very valuable platforms to bring both technical and policy aspects and business aspects together. So that's definitely something for Ethiopia to consider, creating this multi-stakeholder, open, safe space where everyone can participate. I won't say more about the African School on Internet governance. I will try and talk a little bit about Internet governance. I don't have to go into the definition of the Internet. You've heard a lot of that. But this Internet connected network that Andrew and Olaf have spoken about, it's not all. When you think about the Internet, don't just think about the computers that are connected. Think about the people. Think about the content, the transactions, the business transactions, the personal transactions, the relationships, the behavior, sometimes good behavior, sometimes bad behavior. And think about the impact, how this technology, this network is changing our culture, our societies, and our politics. I always talk about the overlapping internet governance jigsaw puzzle. And I think that's important because you cannot just look at technical coordination and cooperation, even though it's a large part of it. Increasingly, there are other aspects and other levels of institutional processes that you need to take into account. There's global, there's national, there's even local processes, and there are regional processes. So for example, in Africa, we have the African Union Convention on Personal Data Protection and Cybercrime, the Malabo Convention. Ethiopia passed a Cybersecurity Act, I think. It's gone through, am I correct? Was it not finalized yet? I was here last year when the draft bill was being discussed. So you have a national cybersecurity legislation in Ethiopia. It's either complete or not, and a regional convention. And then you also have global agreements. So when you are working in internet policy, you need to take those different levels into account. You can also have cybersecurity rules at a university, for example, and making sure that how you policy and regulation that you work with harmonizes across the global to the regional to the national to the local to the institutional can be complicated. There is a narrow definition of governance, and there are people in particularly the technical community who still believe we should stick with the narrow definition of internet governance. And that's really focused on the handling of technical coordination for the smooth functioning of the different components of internet infrastructure. The diagrams that Olaf showed us earlier, technical governance, narrow definition of internet governance, really focuses on making all of that work well. Names, IP numbers. And if you look at the institutions that are involved in that, there are also many different types of institutions. So there's a lot of variety in the narrow approach, from the Internet Engineering Task Force to the International Telecommunications Union, which deals with spectrum. For us in Africa, that's very relevant because most of us access the internet through our mobile phones. And therefore, spectrum regulation and the cost of data that mobile operators provide is a very important aspect of our experience. And the issues tend to be IP addresses, domain names, and so on. But technical definitions and the narrow definition is not sufficient if you think about the role that the internet plays in business and in personal and social and political life. So there is actually a broad definition, and this broad definition is sort of the official within the United Nations anyway, And the African Union, in its Declaration on Internet Governance, endorses this broad definition. And that's the definition that came out of the World Summit on the Information Society. And I'm going to read it because it is really very broad, but it's worth thinking about it. Internet governance is the development and application by governments, private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making, procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. So this, if you think about shared principles, shared norms, that's very important, but also very difficult to achieve. But it's also something for you to consider as you build an inclusive approach to internet policy in Ethiopia. How do you make sure that the decisions that are made about internet policy and regulation at a national level are shared by governments, by business, by civil society, by journalists, by university students? This is not a simple process, but I would say it's the only way. It's the only way of actually having a sustainable system of rules and laws and principles. Sustainable in the sense that if people are not involved in shaping policy and regulation, they're not likely to abide by it. So, and if they don't abide by it willingly because they don't agree with those rules and principles, then you have to step back into a top-down authoritarian form of governance, which does not work well on the internet at all. I'll skip these slides. Just look at the broad definition, the type of issues that are being dealt with. Data transfers, cross-border data transfers, trade, competition policy, that's part of a broad approach to internet governance. Security and stability, freedom of expression, freedom of association online, privacy, data protection, and liability of intermediaries, people like mobile phone networks or internet service providers, or even platforms, surveillance, misinformation, abuse of the internet. So the range of problems that you have to address that come out of this broad definition is actually vast. But internet shutdowns, I have there as well. That's an issue in Ethiopia because Ethiopia is actually creating rules for shutting down the internet, which is a very controversial thing to be doing. But the point is that you don't feel intimidated by this vast, broad range of internet governance issues. You can still decide to focus on your area. If you're an entrepreneur, a small business person who wants to use the internet, you don't necessarily have to get involved in everything, but be aware that the overall terrain is broad. I actually want to move to the end, which is our discussion points, which is, what do we mean by multi-stakeholder? Have you all heard about the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance? And I think it's worth thinking about that. These words become jargon. What does it really mean? And I would say the approach to that is to really think about who is affected by internet governance processes. And that will also depend on what you are talking about. If we're talking about internet shutdowns, for example, that affects everyone. If we're talking about censorship, that affects everyone, but it would particularly affect the media. It might affect teachers. It might affect human rights defenders. If you're talking about access to infrastructure, that again affects everyone, but internet service providers might be more affected by that. People who are building the infrastructure, and then people who have no access to infrastructure would also be very much affected by that. So it's always worth asking the question, which stakeholders are most affected by this particular internet governance issue? And then you make sure that they are at the table. So multi-stakeholder is not just about bringing technical, business, civil society, and government to the table. It's about bringing the people that are affected by the outcomes, and also the people that are implementing. So, for example, again, access to infrastructure. You want the ISPs there, you want the internet exchange points there, and you also want people who are currently living in areas where there's no access to infrastructure at all. I just want to go through, I'm sure I don't have much time left, but just, okay, good, 7 minutes. I want to go just through a few examples to illustrate the complexity of internet governance ecosystems when you approach them broadly. Take M-Pesa, for example. We heard about M-Pesa, mobile money system introduced by Safaricom in Kenya. It's generally regarded as a huge success and as an example of African innovation. But there's also another way of looking at M-Pesa. M-Pesa emerged because there was no banking for poor people in Kenya. M-Pesa is expensive. M-Pesa at the moment, I think last year, Safaricom is considering selling, I don't know if the sale went through, M-Pesa to Vodacom, I think. But currently the revenue, the money that is made out of M-Pesa every year is $741 million. That is a huge, sorry, Kenyan shillings. That is a huge amount of money. M-Pesa is expensive. It's more expensive to transfer money on M-Pesa than it is to use a bank. So another way of looking at M-Pesa is the fact that the Kenyan central bank have failed to ensure that banks in Kenya provide services to people who don't have access to banking. Does M-Pesa encourage saving? Not necessarily. So there's a different way of looking at this. And because the M-Pesa model has been replicated in Africa, there are new challenges. Last year in Ghana, the Ghana Central Bank regulated that the cost of mobile money transfers had to be reduced because the mobile operators were making too much money out of mobile money. So if you're looking at M-Pesa from an internet business and development perspective, it's a fantastic. But if you're looking at M-Pesa from a local and inclusive economic development perspective, it's actually quite problematic. If you look at M-Pesa from a national bank, central bank's perspective, where you're trying to generate revenue to ensure that there's better fiscal regulation at a national level, it's also a problem because revenue that would come to the central bank from the banking system is all going to the mobile operators. Keep also in mind that 40% or 35% of Safaricom, which runs M-Pesa, is owned by a non-Kenyan company. So that's an example of how complex this actually is. If you look at international domain names, in Ethiopia we have the Ge'ez script. We have now names in that. We have names in Arabic script, top-level domain names, but they're not used well. There are technical things that are in place. Sorry, this mic is fading. They need to be part of the root zone. But to really have take-up of international domain names, you also need other types of policy incentives. Incentives for local language, for local content. Initiatives that actually builds pride, that encourages people in using their local scripts and their local language. So you don't just need the technical bits and pieces to be in place. You also need another level of intervention, whether you do that through the education system, through local content quotas. There are different ways of doing that, but just looking at the technical aspects is not enough. And then the final one I won't go through affordable access, is electronic waste. If you want to regulate what happens with old phones and old computers, do you just look at how to dispose of the waste? Or do you also need to have regulation about the production of those products? Rules that would make sure they are safe, that they don't create toxic waste that can harm the environment. There's even another way of looking at it, and it's making sure that that devices can last longer, that they can be upgraded. So another issue to look at when you look at environmental policy is energy. So it's one thing to look at the internet being interconnected, but you also need electricity. Are there ways of looking at use of renewable energy, in countries like Ethiopia, where you're expanding internet infrastructure at the moment, which would make it more sustainable. So these are just examples. I just want to quickly on affordable access. Affordable access doesn't just involve infrastructure, it also involves competition. And just a quick thing for Ethiopia to consider, you are about to move from having one provider to having more. Think carefully about the process. In South Africa, we made a very big mistake. We privatized our national monopoly, telecom, before we created competition. So in fact, we did not go quite easily from a monopoly environment to a more open and competitive environment, because that privatized national provider quickly became just a privatized monopoly. So it's quite important when you look at how to make this transition from having a single provider to a more open and competitive environment, to think it through. I think there's also an end-to-end principle, and that's my closing remark. There's an end-to-end principle in technology, but also in policy. Think through the impacts, think through the implications, listen to other people, listen to people you might not necessarily agree with, so that you get a holistic perspective on that policy problem, and then on the solutions that you are going to undertake, and then build in a re-engineering and evaluation component. Policies don't always work. So in your policy and governance solutions, build into the cycle moments where you reflect, where you assess, you evaluate what worked, what did not work, and then change. Doesn't work. And that's what this inclusive internet governance ecosystem can help us do. Thanks, Solomon.
Right on time. Right on time. All right, she beat you with 1 minute. All right. Thank you so much, Anriette, for expounding on this very, very important topic, internet ecosystem and governance. I actually really appreciate you. She cast a different shades of light on different perspectives. I think the M-Pesa one was very interesting. I didn't see it that way. You know, we all sing about success, which is true. You share that, but the flip side of it, and that's very interesting. Maybe there might be some follow-up question on that. And also the Ethio Telecom thing, or Ethiopia as a nation. Hopefully we can learn from South Africa. The good thing is that it's only privatization, but also there's a liberalization piece of it. So
you need both
absolutely. So that is the model that's being practiced here for this thing to be executed soon. So I think it's in good hands. Another thing that you mentioned, I think that in the governance, I think I did see a big piece about the whole PPP. In the morning they were back about public-private partnership, and I think I did see a lot of that, packed in this in governance and ecosystem aspect. And actually, I was listening to a BBC podcast just a few weeks ago, and they kind of illustrated how PPP is being effective in terms of innovation and national interest. Mexico is known for bad earthquake. So the country so many years ago implemented this public announcement kind of early alert system. And so for so many years, that infrastructure has been under the control of the government. So, but as technology becomes more available, sensors and so many amazing GPS-related technologies, but the government was stuck in that, microphone system and then just one sensor underground in different spots. It was not effective. So at that point, the private sector jumped in and started implementing these cutting-edge innovations, not only just burying sensors under the ground, but also, inside buildings, residentials, office complexes. At that point, more accurate and then a more robust kind of solution. That when the government said, no, this is a national security issue, so you cannot do it. So there was that argument for a while, but at the end of the day, they came to terms to do this very important piece of infrastructure for the country through a PPP. So the private sector would provide this cutting edge innovation, the sensors and all those amazing things that comes from a private sector. the government will continue the governance piece and owning the data and the announcement and the last calls, all of that. So that's one interesting example. And locust is now being a problem here in Africa, especially our country and in neighboring countries. I can see of a lot of collaborations between local government, international government, like the FAO and the private sector. I actually did a small piece on my show how drones and sensors and GPS-based innovations and satellite-based connections, how can they solve this kind of very, very fundamental issue? So think about PPP and then ask about what kind of problem are we trying to solve using technology instead of just fancying things and thinking that it's out of reach. So the final pillar for this panel is going to be presented by another colleague. The topic is going to be internet economics, focusing on economic transaction that happens by different systems within the internet infrastructure. And to talk about that, I'm going to invite Lishan Adam, a researcher and consultant with extensive experience in ICT. One of the things actually Anriette mentioned earlier, the UNECA email server, and I think he was one of those who led that effort. So he specializes in broadband access, infrastructure development, policy and regulation, e-governance systems and application sectors like health, education, agriculture, and trade. As I said, he initially worked on the UN email server and email distribution. He also does something interesting. He's also, I don't know if it's still active role, you can say that later, but as a visiting associate professor in a couple of universities in South Africa. Lishan.
Thank you very much. I kind of came down here so that I'm much closer to the audience. And I would like to, I was given a topic called internet economics. So I'm trying to really figure out what this internet economics is. Obviously, all of us contribute to the internet because everybody, I think, using some internet also benefits. I think it's kind of contribution at the same time benefiting for the internet is actually the internet economics. So we are actually part of that internet economics. So that would be the end of my presentation. So we are internet economics, so there's no need for the presentation. But the important thing is that the important thing about internet economics is actually what is in the detail. First of all, I think it is important to know that internet is actually the foundation of the digital economy. And because it creates this universal platform for information exchange, as I said, we are part of that internet economy. And for all kinds of commercial transaction, although we don't have a lot of commercial transaction going on in Africa, for instance, in the form of e-commerce, but internet is actually the platform for commercial transactions. So that's kind of forms the economics of it. Of course, if you also look at the internet as a network of networks, so there's a lot of networks which is built around the internet. So there's a network part of that economics. And of course, it's also a platform for instance, exchange of ideas. So there's a lot of productivity in the area of institutions. So that really kind of creates a lot of economy around the internet. And then currently, not much of things going on in Africa, but internet is also kind of a medium for creating digital economy type of jobs. So if you get really a lot of jobs out of the internet, so that also contributes more to the economics. And I think what is difficult about internet economics is that because the internet itself, as part of the economy, is part of the other economies. So if you look at the internet, you can see it's kind of sitting in the middle of all other forms of economy, whether you call it like the data economy, the amount of data which is generated, and then of course the IoT economy, which is really growing very, very fast now, the artificial intelligence economy, or the digital economy, or the global economy. So internet economy actually currently fuels. I think that's why we are interested in Ethiopia, that we really need to focus on the internet economy as a fundamental driving force for the country in the future. So basically it kind of sits in the center. It fuels other economy. It builds other economy. So we have to really focus to build in Ethiopia on that change, that economy. The other interesting thing is that the internet economy is also on a constant change. So it's very rapid. So if you want to really see what an internet economy is, you have to actually see the rate of diffusion. For instance, in Ethiopia, internet diffusion is very low, about 18% of the population having access. So basically the size of the diffusion actually tells you the amount of economy which is generated through the internet. So also this diffusion is actually changing constantly. But at the same time, it's very difficult to quantify what internet brings in terms of productivity on individual, on each of us, or at the same time also in terms of the processes. There are some aspects of the internet where you cannot actually directly quantify. I'll talk a little bit about how they try to really quantify that information. But if you look at the internet itself, it has been really growing very, very rapidly over the last couple of years. For some reason, I have some problem on that one. In the world, the internet starts from 0.1 billion people. Today, 4.3 billion people are accessing the internet. And then we have about half a billion African today is accessing the internet. So the percentage of the population that is going through the internet is also growing very, very rapidly. Some people feel that the internet economy is actually created by user-generated content. The size of, for instance, the user-generated content on social media is also kind of fueling the internet economy, and this economy is actually growing very fast. I think you can see the impact on Ethiopia itself, that lots of people now are on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. You see currently about 2.5 billion people registered on Facebook. Out of it, about 250 million people today trying to, from Africa, accessing Facebook. Again, a large proportion of the population in Africa currently also using all other forms of media, Twitter, WhatsApp, and then of course create a user-generated content on YouTube. So this has been really growing very, very fast. And then if you look at in terms of data, this data has been doubling. The zettabyte of data on the internet, it has been really actually doubling annually. We have 8 zettabyte data in 2015, up to now, perhaps 44 zettabyte of data. And in Africa, we have about 11.5% of population, of the global population today, which is on the internet. So we are actually generating lots of amount of data. So this is actually fueling the data economy, also the internet economy. So how do we actually measure the size of this economy? What are actually the components? I think that's the central to what I'm supposed to focus on. I think if you look at the internet economy, you have lots of activity going on in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of digital services. What are actually this is generated by the private sector on the public sector, and then data which is generated either by consumers, and then of course growing sharing economy, at the same time a lot of transaction on e-commerce. So we have to actually see the whole range of data which is kind of contributing to the internet economy. There are various ways of looking at it. Either we can look at it, how big is the infrastructure that we are building, what's the level of application, what's the level of electronic commerce activity going on the internet, then we can actually see the depth and the breadth of the internet economy in the country. I'll show you two specific models that have been used to actually measure the internet economy. One measure is just the one which came from AT Kearney, which is basically used for dividing the internet economies using the value chain, across the value chain, content rights, online services, enabling technologies, and then connectivity and user interfaces. So if you have, when you have an internet, you have the value chain, which is basically the content. At the same time, you have online services, and then you have technologies that enable like servers, and then you can also look at the connectivity, the mobile connectivity, as well as the wireless connectivity. And then from the user side, you have all kinds of interface that we are using, like mobile phones and so on. So what they have tried to do is just to try to measure the economy from the perspectives of the value chain, from where you sit up to the down to the network that enables the internet. The other method that they use is just to see the kind of stack method where you could actually look at the network or the infrastructure and the network at the bottom, and then try to also look at the equipment and the services that build the internet. And then on the top of that, of course, you have all the digital platform and the content, and then of course you have the consumer. So this stack model actually they use to gauge the amount of internet economy, for instance, in Egypt. Try to see how big is the economy, what are actually needed to boost this economy. The more refined that is coming from the group in Italy, where they actually layered the economic model into two aspects, basically the internet IT network industry. So basically they look at different layer of the IT network industry, and then of course look at what is built on the top of the internet, on the web ecosystem, on that. Basically the internet intermediary, the e-commerce, advertising, payment system, navigation system, and so on, and try to really actually gauge that. So if you, for instance, in Ethiopia, perhaps lots of internet activity is taking place on the core network and IT equipment layer, where we get the access. Maybe we have very limited activity going on in the, for instance, on the fourth layer, where in terms of payment system, e-commerce, advertising, and so on and so on. So we can actually see by layering the economy into networking and infrastructure and then web, and we can actually measuring that. Of course, when we look at when we measure that economy, it's very difficult. Some of it you can actually measure because you can have data on infrastructure, data on some of the activities, but it's very, very difficult to measure some the other, because in the cases of, for instance, most of the African countries, we don't have actually the right data to measure how good it is. So what they have done in Egypt is actually they try to see how big is this economy, and then how can we really try to improve the economy. So basically what they have done is they try to calculate the consumption. That means consumption by consumers in terms of access to the internet, and then of course in terms of also the amount of data that the users are, consumers are generating. They looked at the investment in the IT sector in Egypt, and then they also looked at the government spending, the amount of money that the government put in terms of providing access to the public, and also to interconnect the government. And then they also look at the net exports out of Egypt in terms of goods and services using the internet. So basically what they have done is that they try to put that, and then they try to measure the contribution, the economic contribution of the internet on the economy. But they also, as you can see in this string, they basically look at the consumption, the private investment in the infrastructure, government spending, and then they looked at the net export. But at the same time, they had some difficulty to quantify some of the data. For instance, the data on the improvement in the health sector. If you use the internet, for instance, for the health sector, so you may have improvement in terms of productivity. So instead of somebody going to the hospital, maybe the person will get over the internet a consultation over the internet, for instance, like access to the information, so we cannot actually capture that data. So basically what they have done is they divided the contribution of the internet to the GDP, at the same time also other contribution beyond the GDP. In a similar vein, there was a study that was done a couple of years back, 2010, basically to try to see how big is this economy in Africa. For instance, how big is this economy in Ethiopia? So a group from McKinsey Institute in 2010, they tried to really measure using the same, more or less the same technique, where you look at government spending, consumption, the network, the investment in network and infrastructure. And basically, they say there is a lot of disparity between the contribution of the internet to the GDP in developed countries versus the Africa. Based on that data, I think they found that Africa has only about, the internet only contributes 1.1% to the GDP at that time. That's like 2012. And if you see down there, 0.5% of the economy in the case of Ethiopia. I think not much has been changing in the case of Ethiopia. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. So that study also looked at where we can really make an impact on economy in terms of productivity, in terms of internet providing more economic gains. So in that study, they say that if we invest more internet connectivity around financial services, health, for instance, agriculture, I think those are obvious sectors. Government efficiency, education, and retail, there would be a lot of productivity gain in terms of boosting the African economy. And then they also said that there are areas where you have lower effects. So after that, I think we have seen a lot of activity going on in the continent, for instance, in terms of mobile money, in terms of innovation hubs. So since 2010, there is a lot of growth, and then employment platforms and IT platforms, as well as innovation across the agriculture. So there's a lot of activity now going on, as we have heard from Kenya this morning. So now I think it's the next, this time we really need to continue the measurement, the analysis of how big this internet economy is, both in our countries and also across the Africa. But I think the concern is not about what is now in terms of the internet economy. I think what's supposed to come in the future, because the internet economy is not about all people who have access today. I think also the people who are supposed to get access because of its network effect. So we really need to bring more people online over the next couple of years. So we have 720 million people in Africa that are not currently connected. And in most of these countries, the access also varies widely. So we have to bring most of these people in based on the situation in different countries. So you can see the Africa, there's a variation in terms of the level of development, level of access. So what is really in store now to bring the rest of the people in the margins to the internet? So there's a lot of activity currently going on. The first thing is, I think, to actually expand the infrastructure. We need more infrastructure, bring more people online. And one initiative, for instance, by the World Bank wants to really kind of bring 220 million people online as soon as possible, and by 2021. So kind of doubling the situation that we have in 2016 by 2021 at the cost of 9 billion. So there's a lot of initiative currently going on, also bringing universal internet accessibility to Africa, and the World Bank estimate that is going to cost around $100 billion over the next 10 years. So I think that is going to create a trillion economy, because then it will generate jobs, it will generate skills, and also other aspects. Then there is also the need for policy and regulation, because policy and regulation data shows that it also fosters internet economy. And then there's also a lot of initiative around entrepreneurship and bringing more entrepreneurship in Africa. I think that's one we need also in Ethiopia. And then, of course, the skills that are required. And then, so basically what I'm trying to kind of say is that the internet economy is actually growing fast, particularly in Africa. And we have some models. For instance, the example that I have shown you in Egypt, to actually see the size of the economy. It's good to talk about the internet economy, but at the same time, you really need to see, you really need to measure, you really need to understand how big is that economy, whether this is in Ethiopia, whether this is in East Africa, or Africa as a whole. So we have to really do a lot of work. I think most of the young people would take some of these models forward and try to also see the impact of internet in Ethiopia in the future. So that will actually give us a sense of where we should invest, especially in the area of skills, where should we spend, for instance, in the area of policy and regulation, and so on. Thank you.
ቴንክ ዩ ሊሻን። ለሶስቱም ተናጋሪዎች እንድታጨበጭቡ እፈልጋለሁ። በዋናነት የተናገሯቸው ቁም ነገሮች በጣም አስተማሪ ስለሆኑ፣ በሁለተኛነት ግን በዋናው ለኔ ዋናው ሰዓታቸውን በትክክል ሁሉም ሶስቱም በ20 ደቂቃ እና እሷ በ19 ደቂቃ ነው የጨረሱት እና ይሄ ቀላል ነገር ይመስለናል። በጣም እኔ አፕሪሼት የማደርገው ነገር ነው። ስለዚህ እንማርበታለን። ለኦርጋናይዘሮች ደግሞ አንድ አስተያየት አለኝ። እዛ ግድግዳ ላይ በጣም በትልቁ ቀይ ታይመር ያስፈልጋል። እንደዚህ አይነት ኢቨንት በጣም ብዙ ሰዎች ሲናገሩ አሁን እኔ ስለማያኝ እሱ ለሱ እየነገርኩት በወረቀት እየተጻፈ ነውና አይ ቲንክ ታይመር ካለ ዲሲፕሊን ያደርገናል። ሲወርድ እናየዋለን፣ ሰዓቱን፣ ሀሳባችን መሰብሰብ እንችላለን። እኔ ብዙ እንግዲህ የህዝብ ጋር የመናገር ነገር ይገጥመኛልና አያለሁ ሁሉም ቦታ። አይ ቲንክ እሱ በጣም ቀላል ነገር ነው። ከአፕ ጋር አያይዞ ታይመር ሪሴት እያደረጉ መጠቀም የሚቻልበት ሁኔታ ጥሩ ነው። Lishan, you highlighted some important aspects and I really appreciate it. Especially I really like how you demonstrated each components of the internet economy within the respective areas within the ISO layer. So it kind of gives you a good understanding of, okay, which players are, falling into which section of the ISO layer. Infrastructure providers, hardware providers, knowledge-based content providers, or, the mediators, you name it. So that's really good. So without further ado, I want to give the chance to the audience. That's really what I wanted to do. Unless, is there anything before jumping in? According to my time, this session has 15 minutes. The whole thing got dragged, so unless you want me to cut short. Okay, so I just want to make sure. So we have 15 minutes. Yes. Oh, sure. Okay, but I want to give the chance to the audience more. But Olaf, please.
I'll talk out loud. For the translators, yes. Internet economy, I really liked the presentation. Thank you very much. One of the things that I always thought made a big impact on the economy was the information sharing. So making sure that farmers know the prices of their products so that they can adapt their prices in certain ways. Am I correct in understanding that that type of economic improvement was not part of the model?
I think that part of the in that model, because I didn't have time to actually explain. So they tried to also look at the impact on different sectors. So kind of a sector, they went to the sector level, especially in the model that they have developed for Egypt. So they try to also see what kind of improvement in health, agriculture, also trade. So they basically try to kind of, and the flow on. But I think the difficulty they had was most of these is very difficult for them to quantify. So they were really trying to model around that.
All right, audience. So በአማርኛ መጠየቅ ይቻላል። ከሎካል ኮንቴክስት ጋር እያይዛችሁ ከነሱ ተምራችሁ ጥያቄያችሁን አጭር አድርጉት፣ ሌሎች ሰዎች መጠየቅ እንዲችሉ ፕሊዝ hands. Okay, go ahead. ስምህን ንገረንና ጥያቄን ጠይቅ። አዎ መነጽር ያደረገው እዚህ ጋር ማይክ አለልህ or እዛም Oh, okay, here you go. እዛው ጋር መጥቶልሃል።
Sorry. ሩፋኤል እባላለሁ። ፒክስል ቴክኖሎጂ ከሚባል ድርጅት ነው የመጣሁት። ጥያቄ ምንድን ነው? በአማርኛ ያደረኩት በደንብ ግልጽ እንዲሆን ነው። ይሄ ቅድም ሰከንድ ስፒከር ያነሳችው የዚህ ምንድን ነው ገቨርነንስ ላይ ይሄ ዌስት ላይ ኮምፒውተሮች በተለይ አፍሪካ ውስጥ የሚገቡት ኦልሬዲ አውሮፓ ላይ ዌስት ከሆኑ በኋላ ኦልሬዲ ዌስት ናቸው እና ገቨርንመንቱ ምን አይነት ፖሊሲ ድራፍት ቢያደርግ ኦር ቢቀርጽ ኦር ደግሞ ዮር ኤክስፒሪየንስ ሌላ ሀገር ላይ ካለ እሱን ሼር ብታደርግ።
አመሰግናለሁ። ቀጣይ ጥያቄ let's collect few more questions and we're going to make it efficient. Okay, እዛ ጋር ወንድሜ ነው።
Thank you so much. It's not a question, mine is pretty much, a comment and, recommendation for the, program Anriette mentioned, particularly the, school on internet governance. I think you didn't talk about it. And it's going to help the people here if you can elaborate and explain more about it. Because I'm a graduate of that school and I learned it a lot, from that program. So it may help, the people around here, if you just talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, a couple of more questions. እናንተ ሰዓቱን ተዋግቼ ነው ሴቭ ያስደረኩላችሁ። ጠይቁ ጥያቄ። ኦኬ እዚህ ጋር
አይ አማን እባላለሁ። አሁን ፖዚቲቭሊ አፌክት ያደርጋል ተብሏል ኢኮኖሚ ኢንተርኔት፣ ግን ኔጌቲቭሊ አፌክት የሚያደርግበት ወይ የለም ወይ? እስካሁን ድረስ ፖዚቲቭ ብቻ ነው እየተነገረም እየታየም የቆየው እና ምንም አይነት ኔጌቲቪቲ እንደሌለው አይነት ነው እና ኔጌቲቭ ነገሩንም ብናውቀው ለመጠቀም ስለሚጠቅም እሱን ሜንሽን ቢያደርጉ።
እሺ አንድ ድል ሰጣለሁ። Seems like all these questions are for Anriette. So you are answering most of the questions, but the other colleagues can interject. Okay. All right.
Okay. Another question?
Yeah, I know. I was giving that chance. So
thanks a lot.
Please, by all means.
So first, the question on electronic waste. It's a really interesting question, and I think thinking about the question also illustrates the complexity of the ecosystem. Firstly, you will need national level policy about environmental protection and how to work with waste. So imagining that you can just have a policy about how to prevent e-waste and harm caused by e-waste to communities or to the environment is not enough. It will be much easier to develop a focus on electronic waste if there is already some form of understanding, some form of national consultation process to talk about e-waste. And then who are the stakeholders? I'm not sure about the situation in Ethiopia, but in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, you have communities that are living near the dumps, that are working with e-waste, that are dismantling the old computers and the old phones, whose health is affected by the work that they're doing. So they would be an important stakeholder. I would say what to do. I think you have to analyze the problem. I think that's another thing about policy. Start with evidence. Evidence you know, there's this whole thing about evidence-based policy, but often politicians don't like evidence that much. But that doesn't mean that you, as people that care about internet policy, cannot work with evidence. How much waste is there? What is happening with it? Where is it being processed? Another thing to look out for is whether your government is accepting money for accepting waste from the global north. How many of you saw the news articles about the ship that was sent back by the Philippines to Canada? Did anyone read about that? It was a whole ship full of waste that Canada, because Canadian environmental protection regulations are very strict, so Canada couldn't dispose of that waste, or they could, but it will be expensive. So instead of disposing of the waste in Canada, the producers of the waste try to get the Philippines to deal with it, and they would pay them a lot of money. This happens a lot in developing countries. So that's another thing to look at. But I think the other thing to look at for us, and this is a long-term approach, is to look at the design and the production of the hardware, of the devices that we use. We're living in a world where our phones, they last less time. The batteries on phones, after 2 years, your phone's battery doesn't work anymore. You need a bigger phone, you need a smarter phone. I think a longer term perspective, and you can only do this if you have a global level of intervention, is to have principles for the design and the production of devices so that they are easier to repair, so that they are easier to upgrade. So there are lots of different levels, and you don't have to attack all of these things at the same time. I would start with looking at the national regulatory. And then the other thing to look at is the business opportunity of repairing and recycling technology. That's something we are very good at in Africa. You can have your phone repaired in Africa, whereas, you know, you go to London or to Amsterdam, it's much, much harder to find places that will repair your phone. Okay, African School and Internet Governance, just go to afrisic.org. Thank you very much for that. It's an annual school. It's a residential school. It's very intensive. I'm very pleased there are people in the room who are part of that. ISOC is a supporter and a participant in that school, and we run it with the African Union Commission, often connected. I see Victor has been there, Varengai, and you have to apply. It's very hard to get in. Sometimes we have 800 applicants, we select 40. But it's a very good opportunity to get a very in-depth perspective on internet governance. Then I think on harm, I think it's true we don't talk enough about harm, but I think Andrew actually touched on some of that, and that is that, you know, we are the same people, whether we are on the internet. Humans are humans, whether we use the internet or whether we don't. So it's inevitable that the bad things that we do as humans and the terrible things that happen in the world will find their way onto the internet. I think the trap here, which you've got to be very careful about, is to think you can eliminate those problems by restricting behavior on the internet. Take child abuse, for example, and child abuse material. You can regulate it on the internet, it's illegal, but can you stop child abuse by internet regulation? I don't think so. To stop child abuse and to protect children, you have to tackle that problem where it happens. You have to have laws and services that protect children in the real world, in the offline world. You cannot just tackle that problem in the online world. But I agree with your point. I think we tend to only look at the opportunities and not enough at the harm. I think we need to look at the harm, but not with fear, not with paranoia, because that could lead us to restricting the positive potential of the internet. For example, freedom of information and expression.
Thanks, Anriette. Olaf, you want to add on?
Yeah, this is why it's always so good to have multiple perspectives around the table. Because when I heard the question about all devices being shipped to Africa, my mind immediately went to software upgradability, not necessarily the waste issue, but rather the issue of old software that introduces vulnerabilities into the ecosystem. and really downgrades the cybersecurity of the internet locally. I think that is something that needs attacking. But the point that I was trying to make with this is really it is very important to have different perspectives around the table. People that come from things like from an environmental protection, from human rights issues, living near a waste dump is human rights, probably a human rights thing, but also from a cybersecurity perspective, you completely come into one of these problems with a different view. On the harm of economics, I'm not the economist in the room, so I'm going to be a little bit careful here. However, at the Internet Society, we did our global internet report on consolidation in the internet economy. That was a document that we did in 2018, I believe. And we looked at what is the effect of consolidation in the internet. And the result of that paper was actually we find it very hard to say what the actual effect is. Some consolidation on the internet is actually fab because it allows people to do things they were never able to do before. They can set up a high security service and scale up in an enormous way in very short times without having specialists on board. On the other hand, it also creates these big platforms that know a lot about us and have humongous amounts of power in the internet ecosystem. So yeah, discussing the negative issues, the negative consequences of the internet economy is something that we have to do. I fully agree with you. We're talking about a lot of positive things, but yeah, there are also negative effects of being digitally connected and making sure we have an ongoing effort in solving those is very important. And from my perspective, it is then important to make sure that we attack these type of things at, as you just said, on the right ISO layer. And often that is not the layer of the internet technology or the layer of internet policy, but rather an issue that you have to cope with in, say, real life, like the child abuse example of Anriette a minute ago.
Okay, briefly, I mean, I'm trying, quick.
Just quick, በአማርኛ ባወራ ይሻላል መሰለኝ። አንድ ጥያቄ ተነስቷል። ከዛ ጋር በዚህ በኤሌክትሮኒክ ዌስት ላይ ምንድነው ኤክስፒሪየንስ ያለው የሚል ሀሳብ ተነስቷል። ይሄኛው አንደኛ ጥያቄው በአፍሪካ ላይ ዳምፕ ለማድረግ ሺፕ ያደርጋል የሚለው ትክክል አይደለም። ምክንያቱም we have to have ኤቪደንስ ያስፈልገናል። እውነት ነው እውነት አይደለም የሚለው ያስፈልጋል። ግን ለማንኛውም ዌስት ይኖራል። እኛም በአዲሱን የማይመጣ ነው ሊኖር ይችላል። ከዛ ምናልባት ሪፋብሪሽድ የሆነ ኮምፒውተር ወይም ሴልፎን ወይም ዋትኤቨር አይቲ ኢኩዊፕመንት ሊኖር ይችላል። ያ ዳምፕ ይኖረዋል። ግን ምንድነው መደረግ የሚችለው ላይ ምክንያቱም እነዚህ ቴክኖሎጂዎች በየሰፈሩ ነው የሚመጡት። በየሰፈሩ ማለት በየመንደሩ በየሰው ቤት ነው። በሌላ ዓለም ላይ በአሜሪካ ወይም በሜክሲኮ ያደረጉት ምንድነው አንደኛ የሪጂናል ወይም በከተማ ደረጃ የዚህ ፖሊሲ አላቸው። የኤሌክትሮኒክ ዌስትን እንዴት ነው በከተማ ደረጃ ምክንያቱም ይሄ ሎካል ነው። ከዛ በኋላ እነዚህ የሚሰበሰብበት ሲስተም አላቸው። እነዚህ ቴክኖሎጂዎች የሚሰበሰብበት አንደኛ መጀመሪያ ሬጉሌሽን ያስፈልጋል ወይም በአገር ደረጃ ወይም በከተማ ደረጃ ሞስትሊ አሁን ለምሳሌ በአዲስ አበባ ከተማ ደረጃ ሊኖር ይችላል እንደዛ አይነቱ ነገር ማለት ነው። ምክንያቱም ኤሌክትሮኒክ ዌስት በጣም ኢምፖርታንት ኢሹ ከሆነ በከተማ ደረጃ ያን ይኖራል። ከዛ በኋላ ሪሳይክሊንግ ሴንተር መኖር አለበት ወይም ደግሞ የሚሰበሰብበት ሰዎች የሚያስቀምጡበት ቦታ መኖር አለ። ፕራክቲካሊ አሁን ሜክሲኮ ሀገር እንደዛ ነው ያደረጉት። ይሄ የዚህ መፍትሄ ትልቅ ፖሊሲ ብቻ አይደለም። ምንድነው የምታደርገው በከተማ ደረጃ በሎካል ደረጃ? ስለዚህ ይህንን ለመናገር ነው። ሌላ ይሄ ሁለተኛ ጥያቄ የተነሳው የዚህ ምንድነው ይሄ ደጉን ብቻ ያወራችሁ ክፉ የት ገባ የሚለው ነው። ምናልባት እሱ ሰፋ እያደረግን በሚቀጥሉት ቀናቶችም ነገም ተነገ ወዲያም የምንመጣበት ይኖራል። አይ ቲንክ በኢኮኖሚ ደረጃ ኢንተርኔት ሲመጣ ሰውን ከማሳደግና ትምህርቱ እውቀት ከመስጠት በተጨማሪ አንዳንድ ችግሮች አሁን ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ እንደምናየው የሴኩሪቲ የሄት ስፒች ሌሎች ችግሮችም ይኖራሉ ኢንተርኔት በሚስፋፋበት ጊዜ ምክንያቱም ደህናውንም መጥፎንም በዛ ላይ ስለምታገኘው ማለት ነው። ግን ያም ሆኖ ግን ከጉዳቱ ጥቅሙ ይኖራል። ይህንን ጉዳቱን ለማስተካከል በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ብዙ አይነት መንገዶች አሉ፣ ብዙ አይነት ልምዶች አሉ። በተለይ አሁን ለምሳሌ እነዚህ ኦኢሲዲ ሀገሮች የምትሏቸው ሀገሮች ይህንን ችግር ከኛ ቀደም ብሎ ምክንያቱም አክሰሱን በጣም በሰፊ ስላላቸው ሶልቭ አድርገውታል። ዩሮፒያን ኮሚሽን ለምሳሌ ብትወስዱ 27 ሀገሮች አሉት። የፕራይቬሲውንም ነገር የሴኩሪቲውንም ነገር እያንዳንዱ ያለውን ችግሮች ከኛ ቀደም ብሎ ሰፋ ባለ መንገድ ስላሉ ብዙዎቹን ችግሮች መፍትሄ አግኝተውላቸዋል። እና አሁን በዩሮፒያን ኮሚሽን ብትሄዱ ይሄ እነዚህ የሰውን ፕራይቬሲ እንዴት ትጠብቃለህ? አዲስ ህግ አላቸው የጂዲፒአር የሚባል አሁን በቅርቡ ያደረጉ ሳይበር ሴኩሪቲውን እንዴት ነው ዲል የምታደርገው? ያ ግን በምን ላይ የተመሰረተ በእውቀትና በዳታ ላይ የተመሰረተ ነው እንጂ እንዲሁ በፖሊሲ አይደለም። እነሱ የጥናት ተቋሞችም አሏቸው፣ አት ሴም ታይም ፖሊሲም አላቸው። በዛ ላይ ደግሞ የኢንፎርስመንት ካፓሲቲም አላቸው። እና ይሄ የሚያስፈልግ ነገር ነው። ግን ይሄ ችግር ስላለ ብቻ ኢንተርኔት እንዳንጠቀም ሳይሆን ጥቅሙ ከጉዳቱ ስለሚበልጥ ወደፊት ኢንተርኔትን በአስፋፍተን ችግሩን ከሌሎቹ እንዴት መፍትሄ ሊያገኙ ከሌሎቹ ብንማር ይሻላል ማለት ነው።
አመሰግናለሁ። Anriette, I know I'm running out of time. If you really have to spit it out, 20 seconds.
Okay, I promise to be very quick. I think Lishan answered part of it, which is that with e-waste, that there can also be business opportunities in that. I just wanted to point out that the Global Internet Governance Forum, as one of its thematic priorities this year, it will have environment. So we'll be looking at energy issues and waste issues. So follow that process and maybe we can find a way of taking those themes into the national Ethiopian Internet Governance Forum and the African one as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, for the program that she highlighted and then more stuff, maybe you can engage with her separately during coffee break. I really want to appreciate the speakers for their perspective and point of view. So give them a round of applause, please. በአማርኛ እንደመድመዋለን ነቃ ብላችሁ እንድትጨርሱ። እነዚህ ሶስት ነገሮች በጣም ወሳኝ ናቸው። እንግዲህ ፈንዳሜንታልስ ወይ መሰረታዊ ነገሮች የምንላቸው እኔ አያይዤ ነው ያየኋቸው። ቶፒኮቹን ያየሁት ገና ሼር ታደርጋለህ ስባል ነው፣ ግን ተያያዥ ሆነው አገኘኋቸው። ስለዚህ ያንን እይታ ልስጣችሁ ብዬ ነው። የመጀመሪያው ወንድማችን ኦላፍ የተናገረው ቤዚክ የሆነ ነገር ቴክኖሎጂው፣ ኬብሉ መዘርጋቱ፣ ቅድም ያሳያችሁ ነገር በሙሉ ከዛ በኋላ ሁሉ ነገር አለ። ዋትስ ኔክስት ያ እንዴት ነው የሚተዳደረው የሚለውን ደግሞ አንሬት ቆንጆ አድርጋ አስቀምጣለች። እሺ መተዳደሪያው ጸድቋል፣ ኮኔክሽኑ ጥሩ ነው። ከዛስ ምንድን ነው በዙሪያው ኢኮኖሚ እና ገንዘብ የሚያመጣ የሀገርን እድገት የሚያስተካክል? እኔ ደግሞ ሌላ ምለው ኳሊቲ ኦፍ ላይፍ ነው። መገናኛ ሄዳችሁ 4 ቀን ከምትጉላሉ 10 ደቂቃ ቢሆን ገንዘብ አታገኙበትም፣ ግን ኳሊቲ ኦፍ ላይፋችሁ ይጨምራል አይደለም? ስለዚህ ታይም የሚባለው ሴንስ የታይም ቫልዩ አብሮ ተያይዞ ይመጣል። ስለዚህ እቃው ካለ በኋላ መተዳደሪያው ከጸና በኋላ በዙሪያው ቢዝነስ ካላረግንበትና ህዝብን ካልጠቀምበት ምንም ጥቅም የለውም። ያንን የሚያስጨብጥ ሴሽን ነበረ። አመሰግናለሁ።